Hi folks, and welcome back. This is the lecture entitled Debating. At this point, it's assumed that you've gotten some basic understanding about how parliamentary debate works, some of the roles of the various speakers, as well as how to construct both the Prime Minister constructive speech as well as a Leader of Opposition speech. The purpose of this lecture is to get you up and going. You can learn a lot about debate about reading by it, but you really can only understand it by doing it. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you're ready to jump in and give it a try. Let's go ahead and take a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover over the next few minutes. So there are a few basic things you want to make sure that you're comfortable with before you dive into your first debate. First, how to use prep time. Second, the role of each side, both the affirmative and negative. And finally, the purpose of each of the 6 speeches that take place over the course of the debate. Having a general understanding of these is going to make you more comfortable and allow you to have a successful experience as you dive into your first practice rounds. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about preparation time. As previously covered in a parliamentary debate round, a resolution is read which starts a preparation time. Typically, according to MPDA rules, you have 15 minutes to prep plus however long it takes you to walk to the room that your round is taking place in from the farthest point on campus. Since our rounds are taking place very close to where you will be prepping, it means that we will usually have just the 15 minutes with about 60 seconds of leeway time before those take place. No, at tournaments and whatnot, sometimes preparation time can extend upwards of 20 minutes, but that's when people have to walk across the campus to be able to get to their rounds. So during that 15 to 20 minutes of preparation time that you have, there's some important things that you need to do. One, depending on which side of the debate you're on, you need to go about preparing your arguments. You need to find some evidence and sources to help support your ideas and ultimately decide on who is going to take which role in the debate. Now, know that once folks have established partnerships, it's not uncommon for more advanced debaters to be very specific about what role they take. So for example, someone might always be prime minister and always be member of opposition. But that tends to take a little bit of practice and experience before you get to that. So in the case of an introductory class, it makes more sense to just talk with your partner and decide which role you want to take for the given topic. And we can talk a little bit more as the class goes on about if there's some strategy on that. But typically what I tell people for the affirmative, if you are very familiar with the topic, it might make more sense for you to be the member of government because you'll have to respond and expand on arguments, whereas the prime minister basically just has to read the speech that they put together during their preparation time. However, on the negative, since they need to be able to respond to the specifics, the affirmative plan, and read those advantages, sometimes it makes more sense to have the more experienced individual on the topic actually take the role of the leader of opposition. But nonetheless, you need to make those choices before you move on. As prep time takes place, you and your partner should briefly stop and discuss what your strategy is going to be for the round. So if you're on the affirmative, this is a discussion about what your plan is going to be and what your advantages are going to look like. Once you have that idea, then it makes sense to kind of break off and work separately, having one individual work on the topic case, the resolutional analysis, the background, as well as the plan and solvency, while the second debater starts to sketch out the first advantage. Whoever gets done first then can go on to put together a second advantage should you have time. No, when you're just getting started, it's typically okay to have a single fleshed out advantage, but as you get into more advanced debates, you want to aim to have 2 advantages for a given case. For the negative, however, things have more options, specifically as you get more advanced at debate and you start to weigh the various tools available to the negative, such as procedural arguments and counterplans. When you're just starting out, typically the prep time is involved writing a couple of disadvantages. Again, you want to have a brief discussion with your partner in the negative about what you think the affirmative is going to do, brainstorm those disadvantages, and then start prepping those out separately so that you get twice as much prep time. Using this strategy, the 15 minutes of prep time is doubled to 30 as each of you is able to put a lot more arguments together when you work individually. That said, it's always fine to talk to your partner and get some help, especially if you don't quite understand the specifics of the topic that you're debating. Again, use your phones, find sources, jot those empirics down because the more evidence you're able to bring into the round, typically the stronger and better your arguments are going to be. All right. Now, at the end of prep time, when the timers go off, it then becomes time to head back to your room. Typically, you want to try to be in the room, sitting in your chairs as the 15 minutes runs up, or at least within 60 seconds of the end of that time. Otherwise, you might be subject to a forfeit. So make sure to set a timer and keep track of how much time you have remaining. All right. Briefly, let's review the roles of each of the sides in the debate. So, as a review, it is the job of the affirmative to defend the topic. When they're given a resolution, their main burden is ultimately to evaluate that and present the plan. The goal of which is to make an argument that if we did their advocacy, if we enacted their plan in the real world, that it would result in a net beneficial change to the status quo. Remember that the affirmative team is given the power of fiat. So whatever their plan is, they get to say that it takes place. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems with how they implement it, or that necessarily that it's going to result in that net beneficial shift. They can't fiat that, but they get to say whoever their agent of change is goes about and passes their plan. Their burden then is through their advantages to convince the judges that by doing that, it's going to lead to a net beneficial increase to the status quo. Basically, the impacts of their advantages have to make the status quo provably better than it is right now. It ultimately is up to the negative to dispute that. If any part of the affirmative case is missing, any of those main observations, resolutional analysis, background, plan, advantages, if they're missing any of the pieces, they haven't met their prima facie burden at putting forth the case, and ultimately it's very unlikely that they'll be able to win the round. So you want to make sure that you have all of those pieces prior to going in and beginning the round. As we've discussed in the past, the negative, however, has a few more options. Remember that the negative has two main paths to winning the ballot. They can either convince the judges that the affirmatives team will not result in a net beneficial shift to the status quo, ultimately by disputing their advantages or their case, or, and sometimes presenting disadvantages that prove there is a net detrimental shift to the status quo. As a new debater, you always want to split your time in the negative speeches by doing both of these things. You should advance and put forth a disadvantage or two, as well as responding to and attacking the negative. Remember, anything that is not responded to in the next speech is considered a drop in debate. If you drop arguments, that means that they go conceded in the round, which means that they're held as true. So, as the negative, if you read a disadvantage but do not respond to an advantage, that means that you concede that advantage and the affirmative gains 100% probability over its impacts. It is always best to hedge your bets and try to make sure that you both respond to the advantages and present the disadvantages. When you get more advanced, sometimes there's some strategy that can take place where you might decide to strategically punt a advantage, knowing that your disadvantage is going to outweigh that, or some other advanced strategy trying to implement. But when you're new, make sure that you cover the flow and really work the line by line, responding to every argument, such as the uniqueness, the link, the internal links, of the impacts that are put forth. Because if any of those pieces go unresponded to, they're conceded. All right. When you get to your room at the end of your prep time, you want to go ahead and make sure that you set up the room if it isn't already. The graphic on the screen kind of gives you an idea what that might look like. Now, while it's probably not massively important, some judges do really care about which side of the room the affirmative sits on. So, based on just a popular observation and some people that have really strong opinions, typically speaking, to the side of the chairs that sits to the judge's left or the speaker's right of the podium is where the affirmative team sit, and the chairs that are set to the judge's right or the speaker's left of the podium is where the negative team should sit. If you get into a room and it's a day that you're having debates or you got there before anyone else did, you might want to go ahead and set it up like this so that it's ready to go if it's not already. That way you're not having to shuffle chairs and do things like that before the round starts. But again, while this isn't critical to me personally, some judges really care about this, so it's useful to go ahead and sit in the typical places as dictated by norms. All right. Let's briefly walk through the 6 speeches of the debate just to give you kind of a big top-down picture about what you might do if you found yourself in any of the roles in a debate, and to kind of give you an idea just kind of how the whole debate comes together over the course of the 6 speeches. So the first speech in the debate is considered the Prime Minister constructive speech. This is the first speech that happens after the debaters come back to the room. Now, the main goal of the Prime Minister's constructive speech is to lay out the affirmative case. These are to make the on-case arguments that will exist throughout the entirety of the round. I would say the Prime Minister constructive speech is the most important speech in the debate because it sets the foundation for all the arguments that come afterwards. If the Prime Minister does a poor job and doesn't have all the components to it, it really makes the rest of the debate very messy. So important to make sure that you get this right. It's also one of the reasons that we practice the Prime Minister constructive speech more than any other of the speeches in the round, so that we make sure that we are having good debates that allow us to really evaluate these issues. During the Prime Minister constructive speech, there is the typical structure of presenting the resolutional analysis, where you evaluate the resolution to determine what type of resolution it is, to define any key terms that need defining, as well as setting a weighing mechanism for the debate, typically that of net benefits. Second part of the Prime Minister constructive speech is to provide the background, and this is where you provide a little bit of understanding about what the problem is, why it's significant, and why it's not getting better. That last one's particularly important because that presents the inherency of the affirmative's argument, basically why the status quo isn't solving for the problem, and thus makes the excuse why we need to implement and pass the plan. The third part of the Prime Minister constructive speech is to present an advocacy, present a plan text. Plan text should include both an agent of change as presented in the resolution, as well as an action that you wish them to take. Now remember, the affirmative team is given the power of fiat to say that their plan text takes place. It's not debatable whether or not Congress passes the bill if their plan text is that Congress will pass a bill. Instead, we spend most of our time debating about whether or not the plan is a good idea or a bad idea based on the advantages and the disadvantages. After you present the plan text, it is typically a good idea to explain a little bit about how the plan will work through an explanation of solvency. Remember that solvency can sometimes contain up to an explanation of the funding, the agent of action, the timeline, as well as an enforcer, or anything else that needs explaining to understand how a plan would actually go in place. More complicated plans, or plans that include a set of actions such as passing an act already presented and before Congress, may need some specifics so that we are able to understand specifically what the plan does. Ultimately, it is at the purview of the affirmative team on how much detail to put forth in the solvency, but no, there are argument structures that negative teams can make later on as you get more advanced that can call the affirmative out for being too vague. So make sure you provide enough specificity to ultimately explain what your plan does, otherwise that can become a problem. The final part of the Prime Minister constructive speech is to provide advantages that explain the net benefits of the plan. These should be structured advantages that contain both a uniqueness, a link, an internal link, and an impact, and should be fleshed out and should probably draw either empirical examples or some sources and statistics to help prove that they are accurate and true and give them a little bit of weight. A good PMC speech will actually include 2 of those advantages, though when you're first starting out, 1 advantage is enough to be complete in presenting a Prime Minister constructive speech. But as you get more advanced, you should probably aim for 2. It is typically not a good idea to go too much beyond that because ultimately time becomes a factor. The more advantages you present, the less time you have to truly flesh them out and have good impacts. All right, the next speech in the debate is the first negative speech, referred to as the Leader of Opposition constructive speech, sometimes called the LOC. The goal of the Leader of Opposition constructive speech is ultimately to prove that the affirmative is not net beneficial. This is done through 2 primary ways, either arguing that the affirmative team has not proven that their advantages result in a net beneficial shift through case attacks or through presenting disadvantages. As we get more advanced, there are other strategies such as procedural arguments and counter plans and critiques that ultimately a leader of opposition may choose to advocate at this time, but when you're new, typically it makes more sense to focus on attacking the on-case arguments and presenting an off-case disadvantage or 2. The typical structure of the leader of opposition constructive speech can vary a little bit based on what the leader of opposition decides to put first, but it either involves going on case or off case first. If you have a good disadvantage that you feel really helps articulate why the affirmative is not net beneficial and is in fact net detrimental, you may want to start with that. If you feel that your best arguments come from refuting the affirmative case's advantages directly, then you might want to start there. There's not really a right or a wrong answer, though some folks do have very strategic opinions on this, so be prepared to hear and read about some of those. So typically, if you decide to go off case first, you would start by presenting 1 to 2 disadvantages to the plan that show that the plan would result in a net detrimental change to the status quo, and then refuting the arguments of the prime minister constructive, perhaps starting with the background, but most likely spending most of your time refuting each of the planks of the advantages, meaning responding to the uniqueness, link, internal link, and impacts of all the advantages. It's important to ultimately try to get to a point where you can claim that the advantages do not result in a net beneficial impact that makes the status quo better or avoiding the status quo getting worse. That is the main point of refutation. Remember, if you do not respond to the advantages during the leader of opposition constructive speech, you have conceded them, which means for the sake of the debate, they are true, and you are not able to bring them up without being abusive in the following member of opposition constructive speech. So you always need to respond to things the first chance you get, which means you have to do it here. Likewise, it can also be considered abusive to bring up disadvantages later in the speech. So you want to make sure if you're going to read 2 disadvantages that you get them done during the leader of opposition constructive speech so that there is time for them to be debated during the round. The third speech of the debate is referred to as the member of government constructive speech, or the MGC. The goal of the member of government speech is twofold and can vary a little bit depending on what the leader of opposition decided to do during the second speech of the debate. But generally speaking, the member of government wants to defend the case presented by their partner and attack any arguments made against that case, as well as any new off-case arguments such as disadvantages that were presented by the leader of opposition. Typically, the structure of this is going to involve starting by refuting any disadvantages, again, using that case refutation structure that we talked about previously, such as making non-unique arguments, no link, no internal link arguments, no impact arguments, or turn arguments on the impacts or on the links or internal links. Again, remember, don't make too many turns, because if you double turn yourself, that can cause a problem as well. After the member of government has refuted the disadvantages, then they want to go back and defend their case. It's important to remember, if the leader of opposition has made attacks against the affirmative case and the member of government does not respond and refute those attacks, then they go conceded on the flow, which means that the government will not be able to bring them up in their final speech of the debate, because that is a rebuttal speech and you can't bring up new arguments during the rebuttals. So anything that was brought up during that leader of opposition speech needs to be responded to by the member of government, or it is conceded. In addition to all of that defensive work that the member of government has to do, the member of government is also responsible for extending their arguments, right? They're trying to convince the judges that their plan is net beneficial. This can be done in a variety of ways, including providing logical explanations of how a plan would actually work, bringing up empirical examples with evidence, or at least hypotheticals that really help us understand that, and expanding upon the impacts. It is not wise for the member of government to introduce additional new advantages during the member of government speech, because then it becomes easy for the negative team to turn those arguments during the negative block, and it would be new for the affirmative team to respond to those during the prime minister. So really, you just want to defend and build upon the case as presented by your partner during their first speech. The fourth speech of the debate is referred to as the member of opposition constructive speech, or the MOC. This is the final constructive speech of the debate before we move into the rebuttal speeches. At this point, it is ultimately the goal of the member of opposition to focus the strategy of the negative on what is most likely to lead them to the path of victory and to win the ballot for the debate. This means that oftentimes the member of opposition has to make a choice about what arguments to focus on and what arguments to kick as they move forth in the debate. So, for example, if we were having a debate and the affirmative had presented 2 advantages and the negative had presented 2 disadvantages, as well as refuted both advantages 1 and 2, the member of opposition in that fourth speech may decide that disadvantage 1 isn't getting them anywhere, but the refutation on advantage 1 and 2, as well as the impact on disadvantage 2, are the best things to focus on. At that point, they might decide to not focus on disadvantage 1 and spend the remaining time from this final speech really articulating the attacks they made against the advantages, as well as the impact of that second disadvantage. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, so long as the affirmative had not put offense on that first disadvantage. So for example, if the negative had put a turn argument, an internal link turn argument on that disadvantage, they would need to at least respond to that turn, lest it would go conceded. Because remember, anything unresponded to is considered conceded in the debate. So typically, when a member of opposition starts the speech, they'll go ahead and start by kicking any arguments that aren't working for them. So if they decided that they weren't going for a disadvantage, they might extend across a non-unique argument made by their opponents. If they'd run a procedural argument that was met easily by their opponent, they might decide to kick out of that so that they can really just focus their time where they're at. Once they've kicked any arguments that they are not going to focus on, they then need to, again, work on refuting the arguments of the member of government. And this may involve defending their disadvantages by refuting attacks the member of government made in response to their disadvantage. And if the member of government had defended their advantages and they want to go ahead and attack those advantages some more, then they need to respond directly to the arguments that the member of government made on those advantages. Now, it's really important. If you are in a debate round and the leader of opposition made attacks against the advantages of the affirmative team and the member of government did not respond to those attacks, the member of opposition, in that final constructive speech needs to call them on that. And the way that you call them on that is that you say they dropped an argument. So, for example, if the affirmative was running an argument that the economy was doing bad and plan is the only thing to fix it, and the leader of opposition on the uniqueness of that advantage had said non-unique, they say the economy is doing bad, but we saw by looking at reports from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times that the economy has actually been rebounding over the last 6 months, this argument is non-unique. And if the member of government did not respond to that, the member of opposition can say they dropped our argument about the uniqueness. And what that effectively does in this speech is convinces and proves to the judge that the affirmative no longer has access to the advantage because the negative team has effectively cut off the uniqueness of that advantage. So when your opponents do not respond to your arguments, you want to call them out. This is why having a good detailed flow of the debate is so important. So as the member of opposition's speech finishes up, typically if there's time left, the member of opposition will kind of start wanting to frame the rebuttal of the speech by setting up the impacts and understanding why they have accomplished one or both of those negative goals of proving that the affirmative team has not made the status quo better and has proved that the affirmative team has actually made the status quo worse. It is important for the member of opposition to try to use all the time during this constructive speech because their partner is actually going to speak next during the leader of opposition rebuttal. And if the member of opposition cedes any time from this constructive speech, they're actually taking away preparation time for their partner. So, worst case, just kind of re-go over stuff and really try to make that last pitch before you hand off the torch one last time. All right. The final two speeches of the debate are considered rebuttal speeches and are meant to summarize and kind of convince the judges once and for all that either the affirmative or the negative team has won. There are a few rules about rebuttal speeches. Most importantly, you are not allowed to present new arguments into the round that you had not brought up before, and you cannot respond to anything that your partner didn't respond to in their previous speech unless it was brought up most recently by your opponent in the exact previous speech. So for the leader of opposition, they cannot respond to any new arguments made from the member of government if their partner did not bring them up in the previous speech. So, for example, if we had a debate where the affirmative had presented two advantages and the negative had presented two disadvantages, and the member of opposition decided to just cover their advantages during the debate, even if they had brought them up prior to that, if the member of government had responded to the attacks in their advantage, the leader of opposition could not bring up new attacks if their partner, the member of opposition, had not brought them up in the previous speech, because effectively their partner would have dropped them. If there is ever a situation where an opponent during a rebuttal starts to bring up a new argument, you are allowed to go ahead and grab your timer, stop the time, and call a point of order. A point of order then allows you to articulate why they have broken a rule, specifically in this case, making a new argument in the rebuttal. Then at that point, your opponent has the ability to respond to that, and they may have one of three responses like, yeah, you're right, you got me. And at that point, that argument they were making gets stricken from the record, or they say, no, my partner actually brought it up in the previous speech. You can look on your flow at here and here, or they can try to make the claim that the argument that they were making is the first chance they'd have to respond to this. This tends to happen in prime minister rebuttals more than leader of opposition rebuttals, because it's rare that the leader of opposition would ever have something that their partner in the previous speech couldn't respond to, but the prime minister may have to sometimes respond to new arguments brought up out of the member of opposition speech. At the point that a point of order has been called, it is then up to the judges to make a ruling on that, and the ruling can either be a point well taken, which they agree with the person who's called a point of order, and then the argument gets stricken from the record, a point not well taken, which means that they were not convinced that the argument is new, at which point the person at the lectern may continue making their argument, or a will take it under consideration. This tends to happen on judging panels a lot when judges may have different opinions about what it is, and it allows judges to go ahead and make up their mind as it goes. All right, briefly, during the leader of opposition rebuttal speech, the goal here for the prime minister is to get up and basically explain why the negative team won. Typically, this is an explanation of those two things, either why the affirmative have not proved themselves to be net beneficial, or why they're actually net detrimental through the action of the disadvantage. Typical structure here, and starts with a one-sentence overview, where you basically argue why you're winning today. It may sound something like this. All right, judges, again, thanks everyone for being here. One sentence overview. You are voting for the negative today because our disadvantage 1 outweighs all potential benefits from advantage 1 and advantage 2, and the unresponded to turn on advantage 2. Again, basically providing a little roadmap in the speech as to why you're winning. This also starts to mirror the reason for decision that a judge might write on their ballot. At that point, it is then up to the leader of opposition to prove those statements true by working their way through the case and show that they actually are winning those arguments. The final moments of the leader of opposition speech should involve some impact comparison, or at least at minimum, and impact calculus at best. Impact comparison typically involves a weighing of the impacts. We try to explain a little bit why your impacts are more important, and again, for the negative team, why they've kind of proven that as a result of their disadvantages and their case attacks that the affirmative has not lived up to their burden. Impact calculus gets more specific by talking about the impacts through the lenses of time frame, magnitude, and probability. Time frame, which impacts happen first, magnitude, whose impacts are bigger, and probability, talking a little bit about whose impacts are more likely to take place. At the end of that, when the time runs out, we then turn it over to the Prime Minister for the final speech of the debate. The Prime Minister rebuttal speech is the last speech of the debate, and during this rebuttal, the Prime Minister is doing much the same thing that the Leader of Opposition does, ultimately trying to convince the judge, however, that they have proved themselves to be net beneficial, which means that they've got to convince the judges that not only has their plan worked and solved, but also that it has resulted in a net beneficial change to the status quo, changes that either did not link into a disadvantage or were such good things that they outweighed the impacts of any disadvantage still standing at the end of the round. Typical structure of the Prime Minister rebuttal, again, is to start off with an overview where you explain in a sentence why your case is more net beneficial and is resulting in that net beneficial change, typically through one or both of your advantages, and then going on to prove that, responding to any new arguments presented in the MOC, LOR speeches, and then finally wrapping up the speech with some weighing of the impacts, impact comparison, or more advanced to do some impact calculus, where you can explain why the impacts of the advantages are either more likely to happen first, will result in a shift of a larger magnitude, or ultimately are more likely to take place than the impacts of the negative. Well, folks, thanks for listening. This wraps up the final lecture before you should be ready to go on and dive into a debate. I highly recommend that you try to watch as many debates as you can before you jump into your first debate round. Ultimately, the more debates that you watch, the more understanding you're going to get about how all these speeches work together. But ultimately, it really is getting in and having a debate that makes you more comfortable with the activity. So check out some of the videos that I've posted on our course page, but also know that like some of it doesn't really click till you engage in the debate activity itself. Thanks for watching and good luck on your debates.